Are the Bajoran Prophets gods, or just wormhole aliens? That's the question we'll look at this time on The Sci-Fi Show. In the Star Trek series Deep Space Nine, we have an interesting departure from earlier Star Trek series, as we have an exploration of some deeply religious themes. This makes a departure from earlier Star Trek series that have a much more militantly godless approach to the universe. Any gods that were uncovered tended to be shown up as frauds. The Q are the closest Star Trek ever really came to allowing for the existence of bona fide deities. We'll return to the question of the Q in a later episode. This time I thought we'd explore the characters of the Bajoran Prophets. So are the Bajoran Prophets gods or just wormhole aliens? I suppose a person could simply shrug and say, what's the difference? After all, any really advanced species that is really powerful is going to appear to be a god to any sufficiently less advanced species. We have seen that theme explored in earlier episodes of Star Trek. However, the wormhole aliens are different from the earlier Star Trek contenders for the role of deity. After all, the prophets do seem to have at least some of the properties typically ascribed to deities. They certainly have a less than linear relation to time, even if it's not full-blown timelessness, and they do appear to have at least an approximation of eternality. They're also very powerful, even if not actually omnipotent. If they aren't deities, they're at least capable of doing a passable imitation of them. In Deep Space Nine, there is another set of alien beings, the founders of the Dominion, who also take on the role of gods, at least for the Vorta and the Jem'Hadar. Interestingly, the show is quite explicit that the founders are pretenders to the throne. The adoration the Jem'Hadar and the Vorta offer is bred into them through genetic manipulation and conditioning, and the founders themselves turn out to be quite vulnerable to harm, even if they don't have an internally limited lifespan. The founders are no gods worthy of any sort of veneration and are only worthy of respect because of the forces they command. The prophets are different. They seem to have a long history of involvement with Bajor and have influenced the development of the Bajorans over their history. The Bajorans pray to and interact with these gods, and their eschatology, or understanding of the end times, even has a climatic battle with fallen prophets in the form of the Par-Wraiths. So are the prophets gods? I suppose if God is defined as any being that is offered veneration and worship, then the prophets are gods and not simply wormhole aliens. But then, so are the founders. If this is the standard, the various Roman emperors were gods as well, and even some modern-day sports stars and others might qualify. Perhaps we need a different approach. At least in Judeo-Christian theology, to qualify as God, there has been a requirement to have certain properties. Any being lacking these properties isn't a deity, although perhaps is still extremely powerful. These properties would include omnipotence, omniscience, being eternal, being personal, and moral perfection. There are others, and there's a debate about which exactly are required, but these 5 are a useful place to start, and will suffice for now. The first of these properties, omnipotence, is a property that means all-powerful. Interestingly, omnipotence as an attribute doesn't require the ability to do anything, although some people do make this mistake. What is required to be omnipotent is to be maximally powerful, and it requires the ability to do anything that requires power. Things that can't be accomplished regardless of the amount of power at your disposal are not something an omnipotent being is obliged to be able to do. The classic example of this is the ability to make a square circle or a married bachelor. These things are contradictory in terms and impossible to construct because of the definition of each. No amount of power can create them, and placing the phrase, an omnipotent being could at the start, doesn't magically transform nonsense into something else. Are the Bajoran Prophets omnipotent? They're certainly extremely powerful, but I don't think their power level rises to the level of omnipotence. There do seem to be limits to what they can do, and certainly the existence of the Par-Wraiths and the Bajoran religious eschatology suggests that the prophets are far from omnipotent. The logical question to ask would be, couldn't both groups, the prophets and the Par-Wraiths, be omnipotent? Surprisingly, the answer is no. because you can't have more than one omnipotent being. Two omnipotent beings would be impossible because each being would be a constraint on the power of the other, and the definition of omnipotence requires no such restraint. So if omnipotence is a requirement of godhood, the prophets fail on that account. What about omniscience? This is another classic property of a deity. It means all-knowing. It's a really interesting property because it, like omnipotence, has a technical definition that is knows all true propositions. Anything that is unknowable is not a limitation on omniscience. For example, if the future is unknowable because it doesn't exist yet, then it isn't a limitation on omniscience to not know the future, because it can't be known. Although traditionally, knowledge of the future is regarded as something an omniscient being will know. One way omniscience is sometimes understood, at least with regard to the future, is to describe the omniscient being as being outside of time. C.S. Lewis described this as seeing everything as now rather than perceiving in terms of past, present, and future. The Bajoran Prophets do seem to have a relationship like this with time. Their experience of it seems decidedly non-linear. There is an interesting episode of Deep Space Nine Ascension from Season 4 that illustrates this. The Bajoran Messiah figure, the emissary of the prophets, is said to be the person who finds the Celestial Temple, which is the Bajoran religion's name for the wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant. Commander Sisko is thought to be the emissary because he was the first to discover the temple. However, it turns out that an earlier Bajoran prophet, Akorim Lan, found the temple some centuries beforehand and returns claiming to be the long-awaited emissary. However, Sisko and Akorim travel to the wormhole to talk to the prophets and work out who has the rightful claim. The prophets seem perplexed because they know who their choice is. The title belongs to Ben Sisko, because he was the first to find and return from the Celestial Temple. The non-linearity is confusing for everybody, but them it seems. Are the prophets omniscient? Probably not, in much the same way as they are not omnipotent, but they are enormously powerful beings. It's difficult to determine this property exactly because we simply lack sufficient information. There doesn't appear to be a definitive example of them lacking knowledge that they should be able to know. Another property of deity that is sometimes required is being eternal. Being eternal means having no beginning and no end. An eternal being always exists. I suspect being eternal requires being necessary as opposed to being contingent. The basic idea of necessity is that you will exist in all possible worlds. Something that is necessary can't not exist, but a contingent entity is something that could not have existed. Being eternal may not require being necessary in this strict sense, but any necessary being will by extension have to be eternal. It's difficult to determine if a being is necessary, but it turns out to be quite easy to determine if a being isn't, and we can be sure the Bajoran Prophets are not necessary, and even more so, that they do not seem to even be eternal. In the episode The Assignment from Season 5, Chief O'Brien's wife Keiko comes back from a field trip on Bajor, possessed by a Par-Wraith, and the Par-Wraith forces O'Brien to modify the station's deflector to create a beam of chronoton radiation that will prove lethal to the timeless beings like the Prophets and the Par-Wraiths. However, if you can kill a being, then it cannot be eternal, because there'll be a point in time in which it doesn't exist, or at least potentially does not exist. So, the Prophets seem to fall short here as well. Perhaps the Prophets can best be thought of as immortal but vulnerable to some forms of attack. One other interesting property that is required of any being that might be a deity is being personal. This would rule out the impersonal force of the Star Wars universe as a deity. This is likely to be a contentious point, but it seems that a deity that lacks this property will not be able to act as an agent in the universe, will have no goals or purposes, because they're literally mindless. The prophets are clearly personal beings, although at least from our perspective, strange ones because of their non-linear interaction with time. Being personal is an interesting property because it's a property we share with deity, and there can be lots of personal beings that are not deities, yet it's difficult to conceive of a deity that isn't personal. Interestingly, the ability to love requires this personal property. Being loved doesn't, as people can love objects, but to love requires that a being is personal. This touches on a number of interesting points in theology, as love requires a lover and a lovee. Can a deity without creation love, or does a deity require a creation, an other, so that it has something to love? In Christian theology, this question is answered by the doctrine of the Trinity, which sees God as an entity with multiple centers of personality. One final property that is not necessarily essential to be a deity, but is usually attributed to such a being, is moral perfection. I don't think this is an essential property because the Par-Wraiths seem to be worshipped as deities, and they seem to be malevolent. Although, this does raise an interesting question about the Par-Wraith followers. Do they understand the Par-Wraith's moral framework to be the correct one, and think their more power-hungry and vicious approach to be the properly virtuous and superior ethic? At any rate, the moral perfection of the deity can be a somewhat difficult concept because it quickly raises the Euthyphro dilemma. Is the morality of the gods good because they decree it as such, or do they conform to an external conception of the good? Working through this dilemma and looking at ethical frameworks are a big topic and will be subject of future shows. However, it's worth considering, is moral perfection a necessary attribute for a deity to have if that deity is to be worthy of worship? I'm not quite sure how to assess the moral perfection of the prophets. They do seem to want the best for Bajor, and they don't appear malevolent. So what do you think? Prophets or wormhole aliens? I'm inclined to conclude that the prophets are just powerful wormhole aliens. Still, they are interesting characters and are probably the closest you will find to gods in the Star Trek universe, perhaps even closer than the Q. You can find more information on the different ideas contained in this episode in the show notes on sci-fi-show.com. I can be reached with comments via thesci-fi-show@gmail.com. You can leave a comment in the show notes at sci-fi-show.com, and you can also leave a comment on our Facebook page, facebook.com/sci-fi-show. You can also follow the show via The Sci-Fi Show on Twitter, and if there's a topic you'd like me to look into, please don't hesitate to ask. And don't forget, it's Phi with a PH. Let me know what you think. Sci-Fi Show is recorded under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 3.0 license, and the music is provided by Furious J and Maniacal M.